The worst national team of every decade. The country with the biggest economy was the worst footballing nation for an entire decade. A total of 7 teams were the weakest in the 1940s, losing 10-1 in a single World Cup game. I'm sure these teams aren't happy with those negative records, but if you want to find out about the weakest national teams, stay with us until the end. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Having spent the last few videos discussing the new format of the World Cup, today we're going back into the archives and looking at the most disappointing national teams of each decade since the 1930s. Why the 1930s, you may ask? Well, it's a fact that most of the information you can find on the internet about the game before the 1930s may not be accurate. So let's stick to the facts and analyse the worst teams from each decade since the inauguration of the first World Cup, the 1930 tournament in Uruguay. From underwhelming performances to embarrassing defeats, these teams have gone down in the annals of football history for all the wrong reasons. So sit back and enjoy some epic failures, even from some of today's best national teams. 1930s. Starting in the 1930s, the first World Cups were held in that decade, in 1930, 1934 and 1938. It was actually a revolutionary time in football history because the associations finally decided to create a so-called World Championship, in which all the best teams in the world could compete against each other. And since most of us know that the first 3 world champions were Uruguay and Italy twice, do you know who the worst teams were? Well, to be honest, there were 3 main contenders: USA, Mexico, and Indonesia. The third option is probably the least surprising to you, but to be honest, we would put them as the third worst national team in the 1930s because they only played 1 official match in the whole decade, at the 1938 World Cup. The interesting thing is that Indonesia was still a colony of the Netherlands at the time, called the Dutch East Indies. They didn't qualify for the 1938 tournament, but were there thanks to the Netherlands as an oppressing country. The only match they played was a complete disaster, a 6-0 defeat to Hungary in 1938. An honourable mention goes to the USA. Although they finished a respectable 3rd in the first World Cup, the Yankees' second outing in 1934 was over in a flash. Eventual champions Italy crushed them 7-1 in the round of 16, and the USA were out of the tournament after just 1 game, as the 1934 tournament was a knockout competition. And probably the worst team in the 1930s was Mexico. Apart from having one of the worst goal tallies at a World Cup in history, conceding 13 throughout the tournament, Mexico also conceded the first ever goal at a World Cup, scored by France on the 13th of July 1930. 1940s. As you know, the 1940s was a very dark decade in history because of the Second World War. The World Cup tournaments scheduled for 1942 and 1946 were cancelled due to the war, which makes it difficult to name a particular national team as the worst of the decade. However, if we had to name some of the teams of the 1940s as the worst, it would logically be the teams that failed to qualify for the 1950 World Cup, despite being FIFA members: Cuba, France, Israel, Luxembourg, Ireland, Portugal, and Wales. 1950s. The 1950s can be defined as both a period of revival in the world and a renaissance in football. During this decade, 3 world championships were run, and the champions in them were Uruguay for their second title, Germany, competing as West Germany at the time, and Brazil. However, the unprestigious honour of worst national team in the 1950s on our list goes to South Korea. Well, before we start with the negatives, the country actually had something to be proud of in 1954 when it became the first independent Asian nation to take part in the World Cup. And all the positives end there. At the tournament's edition in Switzerland, South Korea broke Mexico's record for more conceded goals at a single World Cup, taking the ball out of the net an astonishing 16 times in only 2 games, 9 against Hungary and 7 against Turkey, without scoring. 1960s. Going one step further, we come to another very iconic period in the history of the game. The 1960s, when 2 of the so-called motherlands of football, Brazil and England lifted the trophy in 1962 and 1966. As for the worst team, once again we have a team that has been disastrous at football's biggest tournament. This time, however, the team that finished last at both World Cups in the decade was Switzerland. The Swiss exited the 1962 World Cup with 3 defeats, the only team to fail to pick up at least a single point that year. And as you might have guessed, in 1966, Switzerland were looking to improve their reputation after finishing last 4 years earlier, only to do even worse. The Swiss were again eliminated in the group stage, scoring just 1 goal and conceding 9. 1970s. And what about the 70s? The decade of some of the greatest players in the history of the game, such as Johan Cruyff, Franz Beckenbauer, Gerd Müller, George Best. The golden years of the game, the romantic period in football. Yes, indeed, the 70s can only be ranked among the 3 best decades in football history, the period when the game changed forever. Fans were treated to 3 different world championships: Brazil, Germany, and Argentina, as well as the great Dutch team led by their talisman Johan Cruyff, although they failed to win the title, losing out in the 1974 and 78 finals. But when it comes to the worst team of the decade, it has to be Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. However, the story behind Zaire's venture at the 1974 World Cup is quite impressive and a little uncanny. Their first match ended in a respectable 2-0 defeat to a star-studded Scotland side. Their second game, however, was sure to anger their authoritarian ruler, Mobutu Sese Seko. Zaire suffered a disastrous 9-0 defeat to Yugoslavia, and, according to some reports, the players were told that if they lost their final group game against Brazil by more than 3 goals, they would not be allowed to return home. Well, to their relief, the Brazilians were merciful and only won 3-0. 1980s. After the iconic 70s, it was the turn of the quieter 80s, which didn't seem as memorable or revolutionary for football in general. Perhaps the reason for the lack of prominence of the 80s was not a shortage of great footballers, but a general change in the world. In the 80s, people were preparing for a whole new life as the new century approached. However, this period of football in history will be remembered for certain moments, such as Maradona's Hand of God in 1986, or Paolo Rossi's magnificent performance in 1982. On the other hand, the worst team of the 1980s was undoubtedly El Salvador. This was the country's second appearance at the World Cup, and it was a complete disaster. Particularly famous was the resounding 10-1 loss to Hungary, which, by the way, is the biggest even to this day at a World Cup. In their other matches, El Salvador lost 1-0 to Belgium and 2-0 to title holders Argentina, finishing with a goal difference of -12. In fact, the country's other appearance at the finals in 1970 was also disastrous. El Salvador went out without scoring a single goal and conceding 9. 1990s. Let's talk about the 90s, a decade that saw the rise of globalization, the birth of modern football, and the inauguration of some of the biggest club tournaments, the Premier League and the Champions League. However, the 1990s will never be forgotten for some of the absolute disasters suffered by national teams. It is true that the 1990s saw the creation of FIFA's famous national team rankings, but we believe that they do not accurately reflect the performance of the teams. So, let's stick to their World Cup performances. And if we had to pick one, it would have to be Greece in 1994. This was the nation's debut at World Cup, and it's fair to say that it was a forgettable one for the team. The Greeks lost all 3 of their matches, 4-0 to Argentina, 4-0 to Bulgaria, and 2-0 to Nigeria, making for a wholly miserable debut. However, fate was far more kind to the team 10 years later when Greece produced one of the biggest sensations in modern football by winning the Euros in 2004. 21st century. With the new century and the development of modern systems, the performance of national teams has been monitored in much greater detail. As a result, the FIFA ranking has become a much more accurate analytical tool than it was in the 90s anyway. And while the top spots in the rankings have often changed since the turn of the century, depending on their performance in the major championships, the bottom spot has been mainly occupied by one particular team that has been widely regarded as the worst over the past 24 years. That, as you may have guessed, is San Marino. Yes, that's right. There's literally no point in describing separately the 2 decades that have passed so far in the century, because San Marino will be the worst national team by far in both. And let's talk about some random but crazy facts about the San Marino national football team statistics. Since the ranking's inception in 1993, San Marino has had the most weeks at the bottom, with the country's average ranking across that 31 period being 176th. In addition, San Marino has played almost 90 official matches since the Euro qualifiers in 1990, drawing just once against Estonia in 2004. How crazy is that? Or how about this one? In 34 years of official and unofficial matches, they have only won once, against Liechtenstein in 2004. However, did you know that San Marino held a prestigious record for 23 years? In 1993, San Marino played England at home in a World Cup qualifier, and although the result was already certain before kickoff, the fans witnessed something historic. San Marinese striker Davide Gualtieri scored the fastest goal in a World Cup qualifier after just 8.3 seconds. The record stood for over 23 years until Christian Benteke scored after 8.1 seconds for Belgium against Gibraltar in 2017. The San Marino fans must have celebrated as if they won a trophy. If you enjoyed that one, you can give us a like, subscribe, or just leave a comment on your views. Can you think of another underdog that deserved to be part of the video? Also, if you want some more engaging content from us in the future, you can check out some of our latest uploads. It will help us a lot. Bye for now, take care, and see you in the next one. Hey, GOF, some of those teams had absolute stinkers, mate.
Like and subscribe.